Jesus dies, the earth shakes, rocks split, tombs open, and then Matthew tells us something so unusual that many readers are not quite sure what to do with it. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. Then comes the sentence that creates the problem, and coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. At first, the sequence sounds almost impossible to picture. Were these people raised when Jesus died on Friday, but somehow remained inside their open tombs until Sunday? Did they come alive and simply wait there for nearly 2 days? Or does Matthew mean that only the tombs opened at Jesus' death, while the saints themselves were not raised until after Jesus rose? Those questions have followed this passage for centuries. But there is another possibility hiding in the structure of Matthew's Greek, and it turns on 4 small words: meta tein eirsin auto, after his resurrection. The important question is not whether those words mean after his resurrection. They do. The real question is what event Matthew intends that phrase to modify. And when we slow down and look at the Greek word order, something surprising happens. The phrase may not be telling us when the saints came out of their tombs at all. It may be telling us when they entered Jerusalem and appeared publicly. That difference does not remove every mystery from Matthew 27. Matthew leaves several questions unanswered, but it changes the picture dramatically. More importantly, it shows that Matthew has placed Jesus' resurrection exactly where he wants it, between the raising of the saints and their public appearance. That placement is not meaningless. Matthew is telling a resurrection story before he has even reached the empty tomb of Jesus, and the little phrase, after his resurrection, may be the key. Start 1 verse earlier. Matthew 27:50 tells us that Jesus cries out with a loud voice and yields up his spirit. Immediately, Matthew begins describing what follows. The temple curtain is torn, the earth shakes, the rocks split, the tombs are opened. Then many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. The Greek verb behind were raised is egerthesin from aguro. This is an extremely important resurrection word in the New Testament. Its ordinary range includes ideas such as getting up, waking, causing someone to rise, and raising the dead. Context determines which sense is intended. Here, there is virtually no room for ambiguity. Matthew has just called these people kekoaimemenon, those who had fallen asleep. Sleep is being used as a respectful image for death. These are dead saints. Their bodies are in tombs. And when Matthew says those bodies, egerthesan, he is describing their being raised. The wording itself creates a striking contrast. Those who had fallen asleep are raised. Matthew is not merely saying that corpses were exposed when tombs broke open. The sentence attributes a change to the bodies themselves. And this is where the first chronological observation matters. The raising of the saints appears in the chain of events Matthew associates with Jesus' death. The curtain was torn, the earth was shaken, the rocks were split, the tombs were opened, the bodies of the saints were raised. Charles Quarles notes that these Greek passive verbs form a tightly connected sequence, portraying the phenomena as acts taking place around the crucifixion scene. That makes the most common English reading understandable. Jesus dies, the tombs open, the saints are raised. Then verse 53 says, they come out of the tombs after his resurrection, and suddenly we seem to have a 40-hour problem. If they were raised on Friday but came out on Sunday, where were they during the interval? Some interpreters solve the problem by changing the punctuation. That may sound strange until you remember something about the earliest Greek manuscripts. Modern punctuation marks were not originally supplied in the way we see them in printed Bibles today. Ancient manuscripts could be written continuously, leaving later editors and translators to determine how clauses should be punctuated and grouped. That means punctuation can sometimes influence how we understand the relationship between phrases. One proposed reading therefore places a stronger break after the tombs were opened. On that interpretation, the earthquake at Jesus' death opens the tombs, but the next events, including the saints being raised, take place after Jesus' resurrection. The sequence would essentially be: the earth shakes, the rocks split, the tombs open. Then, after Jesus rises, the saints are raised, leave their tombs, enter Jerusalem, and appear to many. There is something attractive about that solution. It preserves a simple chronology, and it ensures that Jesus is plainly the first to rise before the saints. But the Greek structure makes that solution difficult. The repeated sequence of passive verbs binds the saints raising closely to the events at Jesus' death. Breaking the sentence after the opening of the tombs separates the final passive, "were raised," from the pattern that precedes it. Quarles considers that punctuation grammatically possible but structurally improbable for precisely this reason. So perhaps we should not move the resurrection of the saints to Sunday so quickly. Instead, look carefully at verse 53 itself. The Greek reads, "Kai exulthantes ekton menium meta ten egersin autu eiselthon eis ten hagion polin, kai eniphanistasin poloes." A fairly wooden rendering would be, "And having come out from the tombs after his resurrection, they entered into the holy city and appeared to many." The important feature is the order. First comes exulthantes, having come out. Then comes metaten egersin autu, after his resurrection. Then come the main verbs eiselthon, they entered, and enephanistasan, they appeared. That may sound like a small detail. It is not. The phrase "after his resurrection" sits between the participle describing their departure from the tombs and the finite verbs describing their entrance into Jerusalem and their appearance to people. The Greek text itself has this order. So what does "after his resurrection" modify? Many English readers instinctively attach it backward. They came out of the tombs after his resurrection, and many translations are understandable when read that way. But Greek word order allows another reading. Having come out of the tombs, after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. Now the chronology changes. On this reading, the saints are raised in connection with Jesus' death. They leave the tombs, but their entrance into Jerusalem, and especially their appearance before witnesses, occurs only after Jesus' resurrection. That is not an attempt to erase an embarrassing phrase. It takes the phrase seriously, and there is a grammatical reason for considering it. The expression begins with meta, followed by an accusative noun, metatein egersin. In this construction, meta expresses time after an event. So metatein egersin means after the resurrection or after the raising. Then Matthew adds autu of him, or more naturally in English, his, after his resurrection. Whose resurrection? The natural antecedent is Jesus. There have been attempts to understand the phrase differently, including ancient variants that appear to have interpreted it as referring to their resurrection. But the Greek form widely transmitted here is autu, singular, his, and the contextual referent is Jesus. Quarles likewise argues that the phrase refers to the resurrection experienced by Jesus. So the Greek does not secretly mean something different from what your English Bible says. That is important. Sometimes, Bible teaching exaggerates original language insights by saying, the English translation completely hides this. That would be misleading here. The mystery is not caused by a bad translation. The mystery is caused by syntax. We understand the words. What we must determine is how they relate to one another. And Matthew's placement of the phrase immediately before they entered is significant. Quarles observes that elsewhere in Matthew, temporal phrases formed with meta commonly appear before the verb or verbs they modify. On that basis, he argues that the phrase in Matthew 27:53 most naturally relates to the actions that follow it, entering Jerusalem and appearing to people. That gives us a very different scene. The saints do not necessarily wake up in their tombs on Friday and remain sitting inside them until Sunday. The text may instead mean that they are raised and come out in connection with the crucifixion events, but do not enter Jerusalem and appear publicly until after Jesus has risen. Does that solve everything? No. And this is where responsible interpretation matters. Matthew still does not tell us where these resurrected saints were between their emergence from the tombs and their appearance in Jerusalem. The text does not say. We could imagine possibilities, but possibilities are not exegesis. Matthew does not identify these saints. He does not tell us what they did during the interval. He does not record what they said when they appeared. He does not tell us whether they eventually died again, as Lazarus presumably did, or whether something different happened to them afterward. Every time we confidently fill one of those gaps, we move beyond Matthew. And perhaps the silence itself tells us something about the purpose of the passage. Matthew is remarkably uninterested in satisfying our curiosity about these people. Think about that. If his main concern were the identities of the resurrected saints, he could have named them. If his main concern were their experience after death, he could have described it. If he wanted to tell us where they spent the intervening time, he could have told us. Instead, he gives us almost nothing. They are saints. They had died. Their bodies were raised. They came out. They entered Jerusalem. They appeared to many. And everything is framed around the death and resurrection of Jesus. That should control our interpretation. The saints are not the center of the story. Jesus is. And this is where egersis becomes even more interesting. The noun translated resurrection in the phrase meta tein egersin autou is egersis. It is related to the verb egero that Matthew has just used for the saints being raised. In verse 52, the saints egertesen were raised. In verse 53, their public appearance happens meta ten egersin autou after his resurrection. The verbal relationship is difficult to miss. Matthew places the raising of these saints next to the raising of Jesus linguistically as well as narratively, but he does not blur them into one event. Jesus' resurrection becomes the temporal marker. That is the discovery at the heart of the passage. Matthew does not merely say that resurrection power was present around Jesus' death. He orders the public witness of these resurrected saints around Jesus' own resurrection. Whatever happened to them begins at the cross, but Jerusalem sees them after he rises. That distinction matters because the New Testament consistently gives Jesus a unique position in the resurrection story. Paul calls Christ the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep in 1 Corinthians 15. That does not mean nobody had ever been restored to physical life before Easter. Lazarus had been called from his tomb. Jairus' daughter had been raised. The widow's son at Nain had been restored to life. First fruits is not simply a claim that Jesus is chronologically the first human body ever to experience restoration after death. His resurrection is different. Jesus rises into the life of the age to come. Death no longer has dominion over him. His resurrection is the beginning and guarantee of the resurrection harvest that will follow. That is precisely why Matthew's little chronological phrase carries so much theological weight. The saints may be raised in association with his death, but their appearance to Jerusalem is placed beyond the boundary of his resurrection. Jesus remains the decisive event. They do not become a competing resurrection story running beside his. Their resurrection points to his. Their appearance follows his. Their existence in this scene announces what his death and resurrection are beginning to do to death itself. And Matthew has prepared us for that idea long before chapter 27. Back in Matthew 16, Jesus tells Peter that he will build his church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. That statement has sometimes been reduced to the idea that the church will survive hardship, but the imagery is stronger than that. Hades is the realm of the dead, and near the climax of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus dies and tombs literally open. The image becomes startlingly concrete. Death is not simply being endured. Its gates are being breached. Then consider Matthew's Old Testament world. The language and imagery surrounding open tombs and revived bodies naturally recalls Ezekiel 37, where Israel is pictured as a valley of dry bones. God promises life where death has prevailed. In Ezekiel 37:12, the Lord declares that He will open the graves of His people and bring them up from those graves. Matthew does not explicitly say this happened to fulfill Ezekiel 37, so we should not pretend that he does. This is better described as a strong thematic and linguistic echo rather than an explicit fulfillment quotation. But the overlap is substantial enough that many interpreters see Ezekiel's vision of opened graves and restored life behind Matthew's scene. Quarles argues that Matthew presents the event as signaling the arrival of new covenant and new creation realities associated with Ezekiel 36-37, and that makes the placement of Jesus' death especially meaningful. Only a short time earlier at the Last Supper, Jesus had taken the cup and said, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Then His blood is poured out. The curtain tears, the earth shakes, the tombs open, the dead are raised. Matthew is not giving us a random collection of supernatural special effects. The old order is being shaken at the moment Jesus dies. Judgment is present. Vindication is present. Covenant is present. And astonishingly, life from the dead is already breaking into the scene. But Matthew still withholds something. The raised saints do not become public witnesses in Jerusalem until after His resurrection. Now watch what happens to the geography. Matthew calls Jerusalem ten Hagion Pollen, the holy city. He has used that description earlier in the Gospel. Yet by chapter 27, Jerusalem has become the place where Jesus is rejected and crucified. Earlier, in Matthew 23, Jesus lamented over Jerusalem. "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it." Then, only a few chapters later, saints who had died enter that very city. Matthew does not tell us who they were, so we should be cautious about identifying them with particular prophets or martyrs. Some interpreters have proposed that connection because Matthew has recently spoken about the tombs of the righteous and Jerusalem's history of killing God's messengers. Whether or not Matthew intends us to identify these saints specifically with those figures, the contrast is powerful. The city of graves receives living witnesses. The city that rejected Jesus sees evidence that death has begun to give way. And notice Matthew's final verb. The saints appeared to many. The Greek verb is ephanistesan. Matthew does not simply say people heard reports about them. He depicts them as becoming visible or manifest to many. That makes the timing even more significant. Their public manifestation belongs to the world after Jesus' resurrection. Now the phrase meta ten egersin autu begins to look less like an awkward chronological interruption and more like a deliberate theological hinge. Before it, tombs and raised saints. After it, Jerusalem and witnesses. And standing between those two halves, His resurrection. That is exactly where Matthew places the center of gravity. There is another reason this is easy to overlook. Matthew has not actually narrated Jesus' resurrection yet. We are still in chapter 27. Jesus has died. His burial has not even been completed when Matthew gives us this strange anticipation of what will happen after His resurrection. The reader is suddenly carried forward. Before the women arrive at the tomb in chapter 28, before the angel says, "He is not here, for He has risen," Matthew has already placed the resurrection of Jesus into the timeline. The phrase functions almost like a flash of light from Easter morning falling backward across the crucifixion scene. You are standing at the cross, but Matthew forces you to read the cross from the other side of the empty tomb. That changes how the entire paragraph feels. The crucifixion is still an execution. It is still brutal. Jesus really dies. Matthew does not soften that. But the moment death takes him, death itself begins behaving strangely. Tombs open. Dead saints are raised, and their public appearance waits on the resurrection of the one whose death has unleashed these signs. This is why the passage should not be reduced to a curiosity about zombies in the Bible. That description completely misses Matthew's categories. These are not mindless corpses wandering Jerusalem. Matthew calls them saints, holy people belonging to God. He says they were raised. He says they entered the city. He says they appeared to many. The scene belongs to Jewish and Christian resurrection hope, not to modern horror imagery. Nor should we force Matthew to answer questions he never addresses. Who exactly were they? We do not know. How many? Matthew says many, not a number. Where were they before entering Jerusalem? He does not say. How long did they remain alive? He does not say. What happened to them later? He does not say. And perhaps our frustration with those unanswered questions reveals how differently Matthew is using the event from the way we might. We want biographies. Matthew gives us a sign. We want details about the saints. Matthew gives us a marker pointing to Jesus. We want to know where they went. Matthew wants us to notice when they appeared after his resurrection. And once that phrase is allowed to do its work, the passage becomes much more coherent. At Jesus' death, creation convulses. The temple is affected. The land is shaken. Rocks fracture. Tombs are opened. The dead are raised. Then Jesus himself rises, and only on the far side of that resurrection do the raised saints enter the holy city and become visible witnesses. The sequence moves from death to disrupted graves to resurrection to testimony. And Jesus' resurrection stands at the turning point. This also gives us a wiser way to handle difficult biblical texts. Sometimes a strange verse really is strange. Faithful interpretation does not require pretending otherwise. Matthew 27:52-53 is unusual. Responsible scholars disagree about several aspects of it. Some have interpreted its language symbolically or apocalyptically, while others understand Matthew as describing an extraordinary historical event. Even among those who take the event straightforwardly, the chronology and punctuation have been debated. But difficulty does not give us permission to make the text say whatever solves the problem fastest. We begin with what Matthew actually wrote. And in this case, 4 Greek words prevent us from rushing. Meta ten egersin autou, after his resurrection. They do not reveal a secret meaning hidden from ordinary Christians. They do something better. They make us notice Matthew's sequence. The raising of the saints is bound to the signs surrounding the death of Jesus. Their entrance and appearance are placed beyond the resurrection of Jesus. And between tomb and testimony stands the risen Christ. That is why the phrase matters. Not because Greek magically changes Christianity, not because English Bibles got the verse wrong, but because careful reading shows where Matthew has placed the emphasis. The saints are astonishing. The open graves are astonishing. The earthquake is astonishing. But none of them is the center. Jesus is, his death opens the scene. His resurrection orders it, and the resurrection life seen in others does not compete with his victory. It bears witness to it. So when you return to Matthew 27 and reach that strange line about open tombs and resurrected saints, resist the temptation to hurry past it because it feels too bizarre, and resist the opposite temptation to speculate beyond what Matthew tells us. Stay with his words. Those who had fallen asleep are raised. They come out, then comes the hinge after his resurrection. Then Jerusalem sees them. Matthew leaves us with mysteries, but he does not leave us without meaning. At the cross, death appears to have taken Jesus. Yet almost immediately, Matthew begins showing us that something has gone wrong with death's kingdom. The earth cannot remain still, the rocks cannot remain whole, the tombs cannot remain closed, and the dead cannot remain untouched. But the decisive moment is still ahead. Jesus rises, and after his resurrection, what had begun invisibly among the graves becomes visible in the city. That may be the deepest reason Matthew preserves this extraordinary scene. The resurrection of Jesus is not merely one miraculous event occurring inside the old world. It is the beginning of a new one. And Matthew lets us see the first cracks opening before Easter morning has even arrived. If this passage changed the way you read Matthew's crucifixion account, tell me which detail surprised you most. And as you continue reading, keep watching the small phrases. Sometimes 4 ordinary Greek words quietly reveal where an entire passage is pointing.